COVID-19 crisis created a recession like no other and caused an unprecedented policy response. But now attention shifts to the post-pandemic years. Will the recovery be sustainable, or this crisis will prove to be a transformative event for the people and the world? To discuss this, we met here at Ambrosetti Forum in Lake Como the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and the former Italian Prime Minister Mario Monti. So, Professor, thank you very much for being with us on Global Conversation. We've seen that the speed of the United States economic recovery has been breaking record. But were the policymakers in the United States and Europe brave enough in order to avoid a new Great Depression, or the risk is still there?
Well, I'm not worried about a significant downturn at this point. Europe is a little bit more timid than the United States. At the beginning, Europe had much better designed programs, but the United States was less timid. And we passed legislation that was basically providing support equal to 25% of our GDP. And Europe has been much slower, and even the packages will take 1-2 years to actually get the money flowing.
So you think that Europe has to do more, even now?
I think it has to do things faster and probably more.
So looking ahead, what kind of economic policies should the governments follow in a post-pandemic world in order for the economies to work for the people, for the real citizens, for the real economies? Because we haven't seen some significant difference or change of the economic model or the tools used in this crisis.
Well, I think in the United States you actually are seeing a rethinking. For instance, industrial policy was viewed as something the governments shouldn't engage in, both in the United States and Europe. Bipartisan, we passed a huge bill for industrial policy to encourage research, to make us more competitive. Big change overnight. People haven't talked about it, but it is a fundamental shift in policy. The success that we've have in bringing down childhood poverty is a major achievement. Under Trump, we gave a tax cut for the billionaires and the corporations. We're now really 180-degree change and say we ought to be focusing on the majority of Americans, not on our billionaires.
And do you see these new priorities also coming to Europe as well?
I think they are. And you know, the pandemic both exposed and aggravated the inequalities in our society. It showed that supply chains were not resilient. The market, once again, had not done what it needed to do. So I think it's people have really realized that we need a new balance in our economy, the kind of what's sometimes called neoliberal ideology that prevailed for the last 40 years has not served our society well, and that we need a rethink.
So do you see a bigger role for the state in the near and, of course, future?
Yes, I do. It's a role in many ways. You're going to have government regulation if we're not going to die from climate change. We're going to need better protection of workers, labor laws, monopoly laws, but we're also going to need public investment, and we underinvested, especially in the United States, but also in Europe, and hopefully we'll rectify that going forward.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
So, Professor Monti, thank you very much for being here with us. So, I would like to start, of course, by the recovery from the pandemic and the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, it's advocated that we are going back to growth in Europe. How sustainable do you think that this growth is for everybody?
Well, this growth is generated in part by the huge monetary and financial and fiscal support provided in Europe at the EU level and by the individual countries. Will this part be sustainable? Not so much. what will be crucial for the sustainability of recovery is that the reforms that the EU is suggesting be introduced by member states to accompany these huge amounts of funds. It's a big challenge because normally structural reforms, Greece knows this, Italy knows this, are made when a country is at the brink of disaster, which is not the case now. Now countries are subsidized for them to do the reforms. Now, to the extent that these reforms will be implemented effectively, this will give sustainability to the growth.
So looking ahead now in the post-pandemic world, what kind of economic policies should the governments follow for the people to change the picture of the economy right now?
I do not think that Europe should completely change its economic model. There are some principles in it, let's call them the social market economy, which I think are sound, and we see that also in comparison with the US or China. The problem is how to articulate our social market economies so that there is at the same time more social and better functioning market without them being in conflict with each other. But certainly what the EU did when the pandemic erupted was to suspend its main EU policy instruments. Rules on state aids, rules on competition, fiscal rules, the Stability Pact, the way in which monetary policy is conducted by the ECB. Now, all this will have, in 1 year or so, to be re-put together because Europe cannot live without some sort of rules.
And in the end, I would ask you, of course, do you see a bigger role for the state there?
Well, the trend which goes back to the Reagan-Thatcher era of leaner and leaner state is probably over. On the other hand, our states will not be able to run enormous deficits again and forever. So it's important to have a greater role for public policy, but also channeled through less financially burdensome modalities for the government and for the state.
Okay, Mr. Monti, thank you very much for this very interesting interview.
Thank you very much, my pleasure.